The fuel line on the port nacelle had been weeping plasma for 11 minutes before the alarm caught it, and by then Commander Ashai Vosk was already watching his starboard engine die. He pressed the distress key, not the broadband panic key, not the emergency all-channel, but the narrowband Keshari communion relay, aimed squarely at the fleet depot in the Varan Shoals, 41 light-minutes spinward. The communion's own ships, his own people. The signal left his console in a tight, encrypted burst, and Vosk watched the routing confirm on his display. Communion Relay Tier 2, Varan Depot, priority urgent. He had not pressed the Terran frequency. He had not aimed it at the Terran patrol corridor. He had not in any way asked Earth for help. The signal should have gone to the Varan Depot, been picked up by the Communion duty officer, and routed to the nearest Keshari frigate. That was the procedure. Vosk had followed it to the letter, the way he had followed every procedure in 23 years of Communion fleet service, and for 7 seconds after the transmission confirmed, he allowed himself to believe the procedure would hold. Then the port engine coughed, shuddered, and went dark. Both engines now. The KCV Paulith, a Communion heavy transport carrying 409 passengers and crew on a routine transit between the Varan Shoals and the border stations, was adrift. Emergency batteries kicked in with a low hum that vibrated through the deck plates, and the atmospheric display on Vosk's console began its slow, quiet countdown. 90 minutes of life support at current draw, perhaps less if the lower deck breach worsened. 409 souls, families, traders, a school group of 37 adolescents from the Keshari agricultural world of Pelinar, on their first off-world trip, chaperoned by a teacher named Sevella who had already organized them into quiet rows in the forward cargo bay, their faces uncertain but trusting, the way young people are when they believe the adults in charge have the situation controlled. Vosk did not have the situation controlled. The Communion Depot's nearest ship was 1 hour and 21 minutes out. He ran the calculation one more time, the way he had run it 3 times already, hoping the arithmetic would change. It did not change. The Varan Depot's duty roster showed 2 frigates available, but the nearest was the KCV Anthari, currently in dock for a scheduled thruster refit. The next nearest was the patrol corvette Drenleys, which was on station 41 light-minutes spinward, and would need authorization from Sector Fleet before deviating. Authorization took time. Everything in the Communion took time. Vosk had filed his distress call, and now he was waiting, and 409 people were breathing air that would run out in 90 minutes. He checked the lower deck atmospheric reading again, 68% and dropping. The coolant that had leaked through the ruptured fuel line seals was chemically reactive with Keshari respiratory tissue in high concentrations, and the concentration in the lower deck was climbing. 43 passengers were down there. 3 of them were children, the youngest members of the Pelinar school group, who had been exploring the lower observation gallery when the fuel line failed. Vosk's damage control chief, a man named Kethros, had already sealed the worst of the hull microfractures, but the atmospheric processors in the lower deck had been on the same power circuit as the port engine, and they were dead. But 31 light-minutes away, on a patrol frigate that had no business monitoring the Keshari Communion's encrypted relay band, a Terran pilot named Des Marrow heard the signal anyway. Not because it was aimed at him, not because it bounced, or leaked, or degraded into open spectrum. Des Marrow heard it because he had been listening to the Keshari Communion relay for 7 years, deliberately, without authorization, on a decryption key he had stolen from a dead relay station during a border survey in 2309. He had never told anyone. He had never been ordered to monitor it. He had never been given permission. The relay key was stored in a secondary partition on his navigation console, buried under 3 layers of personal encryption, and every time Des's patrol frigate passed within range of a Communion relay, the key woke up, listened for 60 seconds, and logged whatever it caught. It was a violation of the Terran Signal Sovereignty Compact, Article 14. It was an intelligence crime. If Dess's commanding officer had ever found it, he would have been court-martialed, stripped of rank, and probably reassigned to a labor detail on the orbital platforms above Sivos 3. Commander Desmarrow had his reasons. 7 years ago, on a joint patrol near the Dravith corridor, Des had been flying wing cover for a Keshari transport carrying 312 passengers across the border zone. Routine escort. Standard formation. His flight lead had cleared the corridor, the Keshari transport had confirmed course, and Des had been watching a game of tiles on his secondary display when the pirate interdiction hit. 6 raider ships, fast and coordinated, cutting in from the debris belt on the corridor's flank. The transport's shields went down in the first salvo. Des's flight lead called for evasive, and Des, already 2 seconds behind because his eyes had been on the tiles, pulled right instead of left. His wingman, Lieutenant Orly Vasic, corrected to avoid the collision, and the correction put Vasic directly in the path of the second salvo. Vasic's fighter came apart in 3 pieces. The raiders hit the transport again. Des got one of them, a clean kill shot through the raider's starboard engine housing that he would never be able to feel good about because it came 2 seconds too late. His flight lead got 2 more. The remaining 3 broke off when Keshari interceptors arrived from the shoals, but by then, 81 passengers on the transport were dead. Compartment failures. Hull breaches in the middeck where the second salvo struck. 81 Keshari civilians and 1 Terran pilot named Orly Vasic, and every one of them might have lived if Desmarrow had been watching his scope instead of a game. The investigation cleared him. Technically, the pirate interdiction was classified as an ambush of opportunity, and the board determined that no single pilot's positioning would have materially altered the outcome. Des's 2-second delay was logged, noted, and filed without action. No charges, no formal reprimand, flight status maintained. But Des knew what the board didn't quantify. He had been playing a game. 82 people were dead. And the board's verdict, no single pilot's positioning would have materially altered the outcome, was the kind of sentence that sounded clean in a report and felt like ash at 300 when the dark was quiet and the names came back. The stolen relay key was his answer. Not absolution. Des had never been foolish enough to believe he deserved absolution, but a private, unauthorized vigil. If a Keshari ship was ever in trouble within range of his patrol, he would hear it before anyone on the Terran side was supposed to hear it. And he would go, whether or not he was asked, whether or not it was legal, whether or not it ended his career. 7 years of patrols. 7 years of the key waking up, listening for 60 seconds, logging nothing but routine traffic and cargo manifests, and weather advisories from Keshari agricultural stations. 7 years of his hand hovering over the nav console every time the key activated, waiting for the signal that never came. 7 years of wondering if the whole thing was an elaborate form of self-punishment, a way to keep the wound open so he wouldn't have to face the alternative, which was that the wound might eventually close and he might eventually forget, and forgetting felt worse than the wound. Until now. Vosk's distress call arrived on Des's console at 14:47 local, 31 light minutes from the Keshari transport's position. The key caught it, decrypted it in 0.4 of a second, and flagged it, priority urgent, fuel line failure, starboard engine dead, port engine failing. Life support on battery draw with a 90-minute window, 409 passengers and crew, 41 light minutes to the nearest communion depot. Estimated communion response time, 2 hours 14 minutes. Desmarrow was 31 minutes closer. He did not log the intercept. He did not call his flight lead. He did not file a deviation request with Terran Patrol Command, Sector 8. He looked at the signal on his secondary display, the same display where 7 years ago a game of tiles had cost 82 lives, and he changed course. His frigate, the TPS Halyard, was a patrol boat, 12 crew, no hospital bay, no engineering tender, no rescue certification. What it had was a pilot who owed a debt the universe would never audit, a first officer who asked no questions when she saw the heading change, and an engine room that could push the halyard to .73 past her rated sprint for about 40 minutes before the thermal governors kicked in. Des pushed her for 41. He didn't tell anyone why. He sat in the command chair and watched the heading change on the nav display, watched the sprint drives spool up past their rated maximum, felt the halyard shudder as the thermal governors hit their first warning threshold at minute 6. The shudder was a familiar one. Every patrol frigate trembled when you pushed the sprint past .65, a resonance in the drive housing that the designers had never fully resolved. Past .7, the trembling became a steady vibration that you felt in your teeth and in the base of your spine, and past .73, the thermal governors began their warning cycle. Amber at minute 8, red at minute 12, critical at minute 16. Des had never taken the halyard past critical before. He did not know how much further the drives would go before something structural failed. He did not particularly care. 409 people were breathing air that would run out in 90 minutes, and he was 31 minutes away if he ran the engines hard enough. And the secondary display on his console was showing him the decrypted Keshari distress signal, with the same clarity it had once shown him a game of tiles. The halyard's first officer, Lieutenant Commander Preet Anand, noticed the course change at the 14-minute mark. She came to the bridge, looked at the heading, looked at Des, and said nothing for a long time. "There's no log deviation request," she said. "No," Des said. "There's no distress intercept on the Terran band." "No." Anand studied the navigation display. The heading was aimed at what the Terran charts called empty space, because the Terran charts did not show Keshari civilian shipping lanes. "How long have you been listening to their relay?" she asked. Des did not answer. Anand stood beside his chair for another 30 seconds. Then she said, "I'll prep the emergency gear," and left the bridge. The chief engineer, Warrant Officer Kalen Rowe, called up from the engine bay 12 minutes later. His voice carried the particular calmness of a man who had been watching temperature gauges climb past their red lines for the better part of 10 minutes and had already made peace with the physics. "Commander, the thermal governors are past tolerance. We've got maybe 4 minutes of sprint left before I have to cut back, or we lose the port coupler." "How bad if we lose the port coupler?" "We limp home at 40% thrust. Takes us 9 hours instead of 2. And I spend the next 3 weeks explaining to the yard crew why the coupling seals look like they were installed by someone who hates the ship. Can you give me 4 more minutes?" A pause. Des heard Rowe moving equipment, heard the hiss of a manual coolant override being applied, heard the distinctive clicking of Rowe's boots on the engine bay grating as he moved between the thermal monitoring stations. "I can give you 3.5. After that, Commander, the ship decides for us." 3.5 is enough. It was. The halyard dropped out of sprint 31 minutes after Des changed course, less than 800 meters from the Keshari transport's drift position, so close that the proximity alarm triggered and Calo Preet, the young ensign at nav, flinched before overriding it. Commander Vosk saw the halyard before he understood what it was. A single vessel, Terran registry, patrol class, too small for a rescue ship, too fast for a cargo hauler. It materialized from sprint directly ahead of the KCV Paulith with a flash of displacement energy that strobed across the transport's damaged hull. And for a moment Vosk thought his own ship systems were failing worse than he knew, because a Terran patrol frigate had no business being anywhere near the Keshari Communion's inner shipping corridor. His comms officer, Sublieutenant Rahani, was the first to speak. "Commander, that's a Terran frigate." "I can see that. We didn't hail them." "I know." The signal was encrypted. Communion relay narrowband. There's no way a Terran vessel could have intercepted it without a decryption key. And they don't have our keys, Commander. The compact prohibits it. I know, Rahani. Then how are they here? Vosk did not answer, because he did not know, and saying so in front of his bridge crew would accomplish nothing useful. Instead, he watched the Terran frigate settle into position ahead of the Paulith, its matte gray hull catching the daylight from the planet below, scored with microdebris scratches across the dorsal surface, the Terran Navy's pennant number stenciled in faded white. The halyard was already transmitting on an open channel, Terran Standard. Keshari vessel Paulith, this is Terran patrol ship halyard, Commander Desmaro. We have your situation. Stand by for approach. Vosk keyed the reply channel. Terran vessel halyard. Commander Vosk, KCV Paulith. We acknowledge. Be advised, we did not transmit on your frequency. Our distress call was directed to the Communion Relay Tier 2. A pause, 3 seconds. Then Desmaro's voice, flat and unhurried, understood. We're here anyway. There was no protocol for this. The Terran Keshari Signal Sovereignty Compact was explicit. Neither party monitored the other's encrypted military or civilian relay traffic. Vosk had served 23 years in the Communion Fleet. He had read the compact. He had enforced the compact. And the compact said that a Terran patrol frigate should not be able to hear a Keshari encrypted distress call, let alone decrypt it, let alone arrive in under an hour. Someone on that frigate had broken the compact, deliberately, for years. And that someone had just answered a call that would save 409 lives. Vosk did not have time to sit with the contradiction. The lower decks were failing. The atmospheric readings from the middeck had dropped to 71% in the last 6 minutes, and the damage control team he'd sent below had reported back with a list of hull microfractures along the fuel line conduit path that suggested the breach was propagating. The Paulith was dying. Vosk could feel it in the subtle changes in the deck plates beneath his boots, the way the gravity generators pulsed slightly as the emergency batteries cycled, the way the ventilation system, what remained of it, produced a thin, intermittent wheeze instead of the steady circulation he had listened to for 6 years aboard this ship. The atmospheric display showed the numbers dropping in the lower deck, holding steady in the forward sections, and somewhere in between there was a gradient where the air was still breathable but carried the sharp chemical edge of leaked coolant, a smell that Keshari noses were particularly sensitive to, and that triggered an instinctive stress response in every passenger who caught it. Vosk had ordered the lower deck passengers moved to the forward cargo bay 11 minutes ago. They had come up the emergency ladders in a steady, quiet line, 43 people, climbing through access hatches that were designed for maintenance crews, not evacuations. The 3 children had come up last, carried by Kethros and 2 of his damage control crew, the youngest boy limp and barely conscious, his breathing ragged. Sevala had taken them into the school group section of the cargo bay and placed them on the emergency cots that Vosk's crew had pulled from the storage lockers, and she had not left their side since. The halyard docked nose to airlock, a maneuver that patrol frigates were not designed for, executed with a precision that told Vosk the pilot had either practiced this kind of approach before or was simply the kind of pilot who could put a ship anywhere he wanted. The lock sealed on the first try. Then Terran crew began coming through. 12 people, that was all Desmaro had. 12 crew on a frigate built for patrol, not rescue. But they came through the lock organized, loaded with gear, moving with the unhesitating efficiency of people who had already briefed each other during the sprint and knew exactly where they were going. First through was Petty Officer Nara Ling, Engineering, who took one look at the Paulith's atmospheric readouts on the airlock panel and began bolting a portable atmospheric processor to the nearest ventilation manifold without asking permission, without introducing herself, without pausing. She had the first unit running in 4 minutes. Then she pulled a second processor from the case she'd carried through the lock, walked 30 meters down the main corridor to the next ventilation junction, and had that one running in 3. Behind her came the medic, Petty Officer Second Class Driscoll, who walked directly to the triage area Vosk's crew had set up in the forward cargo bay, and began checking the 43 passengers who had been in the lower decks when the atmosphere started to fail. Oxygen deprivation. Chemical burns from the coolant that had leaked through the ruptured fuel line seals. 3 children among them, gray-faced and too quiet, their breathing shallow and fast. Co had them on supplemental oxygen within 8 minutes of boarding. The masks were designed for Terran faces and did not fit Keshari ones. She improvised adapters from medical tape and a length of flexible tubing, testing the seal on each mask by hand with a practiced motion that suggested she had improvised medical equipment in the field before, though probably not for Keshari physiology. The adapters weren't elegant. They held. Behind Des came 2 more engineers carrying hull patch kits, a communications specialist who immediately began routing the Paulith's internal comm system through the halyard's more powerful array so Vosk could reach all compartments, and a damage control pair who went straight to the lower decks to assess the hull breach. Each of them moved without hesitation, without asking for directions, without waiting for Vosk's authorization. They had been briefed. They knew the layout of a communion-heavy transport, or they had studied it during the 31-minute sprint. Des came through last. He walked onto the Paulith's bridge and found Vosk standing at the command console, watching the atmospheric numbers. They were already climbing, 82% in the forward sections, 76% in the mid-deck. The lower deck, where the breach had been worst, was still at 59%, but the Terran processors were holding the line. Des was shorter than Vosk had expected from his voice, broad-shouldered with a pilot's hands, scarred across the knuckles from years of maintenance work that most commanders delegated. His face looked like it hadn't rested properly in a long time. Not exhaustion exactly, something older than that. The kind of tiredness that sleep didn't fix, because it didn't come from lack of sleep. "Commander Vosk," Des said, "my engineer says your port fuel line can be patched, field repair. Won't hold permanently, but it'll hold long enough for you to make the Varan shoals under reduced thrust. 60%, maybe 14 hours. "That's good news, Commander Marrow. She's already on it. Should have the patch in place within the hour. In the meantime, we've got 2 atmospheric processors running in your forward sections, and my damage control team is sealing the micro-fractures in your lower deck. Your atmosphere should stabilize within 30 minutes. Vosk nodded, then he said carefully, "You heard our signal." "Yes." "On our encrypted relay." Des did not look away. "Yes." "That's a violation of the Signal Sovereignty Compact, Article 14. "It is." Vosk waited. In the Communion fleet, when an officer admitted a breach, they followed it with an explanation, a justification, a plea for context. Des offered none. He stood on the Paulith's bridge with his scarred hands still at his sides and let the admission sit between them like a fact that needed no decoration. "Why?" Vosk asked. Des looked at the forward viewport. The Paulith's emergency lights cast a faint amber wash across the bridge consoles, and beyond the viewport, the stars of the inner shoals were scattered across the dark in clusters of blue and white, the kind of sky that navigators used as a calibration reference, because the star density was so consistent. 7 years ago, Des said, I was flying wing cover for one of your transports, Dravith Corridor. Raiders hit the convoy. I was 2 seconds slow on the brake because I was watching a game on my secondary display instead of my scope. My wingman, Lieutenant Vasic, corrected to avoid my bad turn and flew directly into the second salvo. He died. The Raiders hit your transport in the same pass. 81 of your passengers died in the hull breach. Vosk said nothing. He remembered the Dravith Corridor incident. Every Keshari officer did. It had been a diplomatic incident for months, the kind that generated reports and inquiries and quiet professional anger that took years to fade. The names of the dead had been read in the communion assembly. Vosk had been a sub-commander at the time, stationed 2 sectors away, and he had listened to the reading on the fleet-wide broadcast, standing at attention on his own bridge while 81 names and 1 Terrans were spoken into the record. The investigation cleared me, Des continued. Said no single pilot could have changed the outcome. Maybe that's true in the aggregate. Maybe Vasek was dead regardless. I don't know. I'll never know. But I was playing a game when the alarm hit. I was looking at the wrong screen, and 82 people died while I was 2 seconds behind where I should have been. He paused. His hands were still at his sides, absolutely motionless, which Vosk had learned in 23 years of working alongside Terrans was not natural for them. Terrans were fidgeters, pacers, tappers of fingers against surfaces, drummers of rhythms on consoles, constant small motion even at rest. When a Terran's hands went perfectly still, it meant something internal was being held in place with considerable effort. After the investigation, I took a border survey assignment. Routine mapping. No escort duty, no combat rotation, nothing where the stakes were high. During the survey, I found an abandoned communion relay station at the edge of the corridor, dead for years. The power cells were spent, the antennas were degraded, the hull was pocked with micrometeor impacts, but the signal key was still in the system, stored in a hardware module that hadn't been wiped when the station was decommissioned. You took it. I took it. Stored it on my nav console. Built a listener that wakes up every time we pass within relay range. 60-second sweep, communion band, encrypted traffic. If one of your ships is in trouble and I'm close enough, I hear it. And then you go. And then I go. Vosk studied him, regardless of authorization. Yes. Regardless of the compact. Yes. Regardless of what it costs you. Des met his eyes. With respect, Commander, the cost is mine to pay. Vosk had commanded ships for 15 years. He had seen bravery in forms both useful and wasteful. He had seen Terran recklessness that looked like heroism until you examined the aftermath. He had seen guilt dressed up as duty, and duty dressed up as guilt, and sometimes they were so tangled that even the person carrying them couldn't sort out which was which. This was something different. This was a man who had found the only answer he could live with, and who had been carrying it in silence for 7 years, knowing it would destroy his career the moment it mattered. Not because he wanted to be a hero, not because he believed he could balance the ledger, but because the alternative flying patrols with the relay key silent, knowing he could have listened and chose not to, was a version of himself he could not live inside. Vosk had spent 23 years reading officers. He had learned to separate the genuine from the performed, the deeply held from the briefly felt. What he saw in Des Marrow's face was not performance. It was the most honest thing in the room. Your medic, Vosk said. She's treating the children from the lower deck. Petty Officer Co, yes. The 3 youngest, they're stable. Co says they'll make it. Low oxygen exposure, but no permanent neurological damage if we keep them on supplemental for the next several hours. The masks aren't ideal, but the adapters are holding. Vosk glanced at his console. The atmospheric numbers continued to climb, 84% forward, 79 mid-deck. The lower deck had reached 63. The Terran processors were small, portable units designed for a 12-person frigate, and they were stabilizing a ship built for 400. In the cargo bay below, the sounds were changing. When the halyard's crew first came aboard, the Paulith had been quiet in the worst way. The kind of quiet that meant people were conserving breath and trying not to think about the numbers on the atmospheric display. Now Vosk could hear movement, voices, a tool striking metal in the engine bay where Nara Leng was working on the fuel line patch, a child's voice from the triage area asking something in Keshari that Vosk couldn't quite make out. the hiss of a hull sealant canister from the lower deck, where the damage control pair was working through the microfracture list. And then laughter, thin and startled, the sound a child makes when something unexpected happens. Vosk looked at the internal feed and saw one of the Terran damage control crew, a young man whose name he didn't know, juggling 3 hull patch canisters in the cargo bay while the school group from Pelennor watched from their emergency cots. The children were wrapped in thermal blankets, some still connected to supplemental oxygen lines, and they were watching this Terran stranger juggle emergency equipment with the wide-eyed fascination of young people who had been terrified 10 minutes ago and were now being offered something they didn't expect, a reason to stop being afraid. Des heard the laughter too. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, very small, in a face that had been holding still for a long time. "Commander Marrow," Vosk said. "Sir?" "I'm going to file a report with the Communion." Des's eyes changed, not fear, recognition. The thing he had expected was happening. "I'm going to file a report," Vosk continued, stating that at 1447 local, the Keshari Communion vessel Paulith experienced a dual-engine failure and transmitted a priority urgent distress call on the Communion Relay Tier 2. The report will state that the Terran patrol ship Halyard intercepted the distress call. Des waited. "The report will also state," Vosk said, "that the intercept occurred because the Terran vessel's broad-spectrum scanning array, a standard feature of the TPS patrol class, detected anomalous signal energy in the subspace layer adjacent to the Communion relay band. Passive detection. Unintentional. Consistent with known signal bleed from Tier 2, relays at distances below 40 light minutes." Des stared at him. "I've reviewed the technical specifications of your patrol class, Commander Marrow. Published specifications, available in the Communion Naval Archive. The broad-spectrum array on a TPS-class frigate is sensitive enough to detect signal bleed at 31 light minutes. It would have flagged the emission pattern. Your navigation officer would have investigated. You would have recognized a distress signature and responded, all within the boundaries of the compact." Des said, "Commander, that isn't what happened." "I know what happened." Silence on the bridge. The atmospheric processor hummed. Below, in the cargo bay, the laughter had faded into the quieter sound of children talking to each other, processing what had happened to them in the way that young people do, half bravado and half shock. "You listened to our relay for 7 years, Vosk said, illegally, without authorization, because you were carrying something you couldn't put down." Des said nothing. 81 passengers died on the Dravith Corridor transport. I was a sub-commander at the time. I remember the inquiry. I remember the names. I stood at attention on my own bridge while they were read into the record. "So do I," Des said quietly. "And today you answered a call that wasn't aimed at you, on a frequency you had no legal right to hear, and you brought 12 people onto my ship, and they are saving 409 lives, including 43 passengers from the lower deck who would not have survived another hour, including 3 children." Vosk turned back to his console. He pulled up the routing log one more time, the record of his distress transmission. Communion Relay Tier 2, Varan Depot, priority urgent. Clean routing, clean encryption, clean delivery to the intended recipient. Nothing in the log pointed to the Terran patrol corridor. "Unless you wrote the report the right way." "I'm filing the signal bleed version," Vosk said. "Because that is the report that keeps a competent pilot in the patrol corridor where he belongs. And because the next time a Keshari ship is in trouble within 31 light minutes of your patrol route, Commander Marrow, I want the man who has been listening for 7 years to still be there to hear it." Des was quiet for a long time. His hands, which had been locked at his sides for the entire conversation, moved, slightly. A tremor in the left, the kind that comes not from fear but from something held too tight for too long finally shifting, not releasing, just shifting enough to breathe. The debt, Vosk said. The one you've been carrying since the Dravith corridor. Yes. It doesn't balance, you know that. 81 dead against 409 saved. The arithmetic doesn't work that way. It never does. I know. But it's the wrong arithmetic, Vosk said. The question was never whether the numbers even out. The question was whether you'd still be the kind of man who goes. He met Dessa's eyes across the bridge. You went. For 7 years, you went every time there was nothing to find. And today, when there was something, you went again. You burned your thermal governors, you broke the compact, and you came anyway. That's not a debt being paid. That's duty being kept. Des looked at the deck plates, then he looked up. Commander Vosk, the report. If Terran Patrol Command investigates the deviation and pulls the halyards logs, they'll find the course change. No logged intercept. No deviation request. They'll ask questions I can't answer honestly without explaining the relay key. Then the Communion's report will need to arrive first. You'd do that. Commander Marrow, you crossed 31 light minutes of empty space in a frigate not rated for rescue, burning your engines past their limits, to answer a call you had no legal right to hear. You did it knowing it would end your career. You did it because 7 years ago you were looking at the wrong screen, and you decided you would spend the rest of your career looking at the right one. Vosk saved the atmospheric readouts and began composing the formal report on his command console. The least I can do is make sure the paperwork matches the man. Des stood on the bridge of the Paulith for another moment. Then he nodded once, turned, and went below to check on his crew. In the cargo bay, the scene had changed. When the halyard's crew first came aboard, the bay had been a place of controlled emergency, voices low, movements careful, the atmosphere that settles over a group of people who know the numbers are bad and are trying not to look at the clock. Now the Terran processors had pushed the forward and mid-deck readings past 85%, and the air tasted different. Not good, exactly, but not dying. Nara Ling emerged from the engine bay with coolant stains on her sleeves, and her utility belt hanging lower on one side where she'd emptied 3 of its 5 pouches into the repair. Fuel line patch is in, she said. Compression sleeve from our emergency kit bonded with hull sealant. It's ugly, Commander, but it's tight. She'll hold for the transit. How long? 14 hours at 60%. The Paulith's helm can manage it. I've already talked to their engineer, a man named Kethros, and he's calibrating the thrust governors for the reduced output. Good work, Lang. Commander, she hesitated. I ran a diagnostic on their port nacelle while I was in there. The fuel line failure wasn't mechanical wear. They've got a manufacturing defect in the conduit junction. Hairline stress fracture in the alloy. It's been propagating for months, maybe longer. The fracture pattern is consistent with a batch defect in the alloy stock. If they'd made it to the Varan Shoals today, the same line would have failed on the next run, or the one after that. Can you flag it? Already did. Wrote a note for Kethros. Told him to pull the whole junction assembly and replace it before the next transit. I also marked 3 other conduit points that show the same stress pattern. Their whole fuel line network is compromised. It's not just this ship, Commander. If the alloy batch went to other Communion transports, they've got a fleet-wide problem. That's beyond our mission scope, Ling. Commander, with respect, our mission scope today seems to be whatever needs doing. Des almost smiled. It was a near thing, a small flexion at the corners of his mouth that didn't quite complete itself, the closest his face had managed in longer than he wanted to count. Carry on. In the triage area, Adris Ko was finishing her rounds. The 43 lower-deck passengers were stable. Most were sitting up, the supplemental oxygen doing its work, color returning to faces that had been gray and drawn when Ko first reached them. The chemical burns were superficial on most. 3 patients had deeper burns that Ko had cleaned and bandaged with Terran medical supplies, adapting the wound dressings for Keshari physiology by cutting them to fit the different proportions of Keshari limbs, using a field reference she'd pulled up on her medical tablet during the sprint. She'd never treated a Keshari patient before today. She was not going to let that stop her. The 3 children were the ones Des came to see. They were sitting on adjacent cots in a row, wrapped in emergency thermal blankets that were silver on the outside and reflected the cargo bay lights in shifting patterns. The youngest, a boy of perhaps 4 standard years, was asleep, his breathing steady under the improvised oxygen mask, one small hand curled around the edge of the blanket. The middle child, a boy of 6, was watching the Terran damage control technician, who had finished juggling and was now showing a group of Keshari adolescents from the Pelennor school trip how hull patch sealant worked, using hand gestures and a slow, deliberate speaking pace that needed no translator. The adolescents were leaning in, their earlier fear replaced by the universal curiosity of young people watching someone make something work with their hands. The oldest, a girl of 8 or so, was watching Des. She had the large dark eyes common to Keshari young, proportionally oversized in a face that still carried the roundness of childhood. She had been gray-faced and gasping when Ko reached her, her oxygen saturation low enough that Ko had prioritized her over 2 adult patients who were in better shape. Now she was breathing steadily through the improvised adapter, one hand gripping the cot's edge, the other holding a piece of emergency ration bar that the Terran engineer had given her. She looked at him the way children look at adults they cannot categorize, not afraid. Not grateful, because gratitude requires understanding what was at stake, and she probably did not yet fully understand how close the numbers had come. Just attentive, watching, trying to figure out what kind of person this was. Des looked back at her and thought about the children on the Dravith corridor transport. He didn't know how many of the 81 dead had been children. He had never looked. He had memorized the names and the count, and had never been able to make himself sort them by age, because there was a line past which the knowing became something he could not carry and still function. Ko appeared beside him. "Commander, all 43 stable. The 3 children will need another 4 to 6 hours on supplemental. The youngest inhaled coolant vapor. I've got him on a bronchial wash. Terran pharmacology, but the chemistry should be compatible based on the cross-species medical database. I'll monitor him personally." "Good work, Ko." "Sir," she paused. "The school group's teacher, a woman named Sevilla, asked me to pass along something." "What?" "She said the children would like to know the name of the ship that came." Des was quiet. "The TPS Halyard." "She said they'd like to know the captain's name." He looked at the cargo bay, at the Keshari families and traders and students, at his own crew moving among them with processors and medical kits and sealant, at the slow, steady work of keeping 409 people alive in a ship that had been dying an hour ago, at the damage control technician dealing cards from a worn deck onto an overturned supply crate, while the Pelennor adolescents watched and argued about the rules of a game they'd never seen before. "Tell her it doesn't matter," he said. Ko raised an eyebrow. "Tell her the ship came, that's what matters." Ko studied him for a moment, the way medics study patients who are telling the truth about the wrong thing. Then she nodded and went back to work. Anand called down from the halyard. "Commander, thermal governors are back in tolerance. Rowe says we can sustain standard cruise. The Paulith's helm confirms she's ready for transit. Set up the escort formation. Halyard holds 100 meters off her starboard flank. Standard convoy protocol." "Understood." "And Commander." "Go ahead." The deviation logs. When Patrol Command reviews them, they'll see the course change with no logged intercept request. A pause. "I know Anand. Commander Vosk is filing a report with the Communion. Signal bleed from their relay. Passive detection by our broad-spectrum array. That's correct. The broad-spectrum array. It is technically sensitive enough to detect Tier 2 relay emissions at 31 light minutes, a beat. I checked the specs during the sprint. You check the specs? I check a lot of things during sprints, Commander. Passes the time. The TPS Patrol Class Broad-Spectrum Array has a documented sensitivity range that includes the Tier 2 relay sideband. It's in the technical manual. Section 14, subsection 3. I made a note. Preet, thank you. Nothing to thank me for, sir. The specs are what they are. The Paulith and the halyard left the drift point together at 1623 local, the patrol frigate tucked close beside the heavy transport, running lights marking the distance between them in steady blue and white pulses. The Paulith moved at 60% thrust, her patched fuel line holding, the atmospheric processors humming in the cargo bay, the 409 settling into the long transit the way people do when the crisis has passed, and the exhaustion finally arrives. Below, Terran and Keshari crew moved between cots and processors and patched hull sections, trading tools and water bottles, and the stripped-down shorthand of people who had work to do and no interest in which flag flew over it. Ro had come aboard the Paulith to help Kethros with the thrust governor calibration, and the two engineers were working side by side in the Paulith's engine bay, speaking a pidgin of Terran technical standard and Keshari engineering notation that neither had learned formally, but both understood instantly. Ro showed Kethros a bypass technique for routing around the damaged conduit section. Kethros showed Ro the Communion's approach to thermal management in the fuel line network. Neither asked permission to share the information. Neither logged it in their respective fleets' technical exchange protocols. In the forward observation alcove, Sevala found Des standing at the viewport while the Paulith settled into her transit speed. She was a tall woman, even for Keshari, with the weathered hands of someone who worked the soil on Sevala Pellinor, and the steady gaze of someone who was responsible for 37 young people in a crisis, and had not once lost her composure. Commander Marrow. Teacher Sevala. The children are asking questions about your ship, about your crew. They want to know why you came. Des looked at her. We detected a distress signal. The communion relay is encrypted, Commander. We all know that. The children know that. The older ones, the 17-year-olds, they have been discussing it for the past hour. They want to know why a Terran patrol frigate could hear an encrypted Keshari signal. Our broad-spectrum scanning array detected signal bleed from the relay. It's documented. Sevala studied him for a long moment. She had the Keshari directness that Des had encountered before in teachers and farmers and people who worked with living things, and had no patience for evasion. Commander, I teach agricultural science to adolescents on a farming world at the edge of the communion. I don't know anything about broad-spectrum arrays or signal bleed or the compact, but I know what it looks like when someone answers a call they weren't supposed to hear. I've seen it in my students, when one of them comes running to help another before anyone has asked. She paused. I don't need to know how you heard us, Commander. I need you to know that the youngest child, the 4-year-old, his name is Tolev. His mother is in the forward cargo bay. She hasn't let go of his hand since your medic put the mask on him. She asked me to tell you that she will remember the name Halyard for the rest of her life. Des said nothing. That's all, Sevala said. That's what I came to tell you. She turned and walked back toward the cargo bay, her footsteps steady on the deck plates, and Des stood at the viewport for another minute, watching the stars move at 60% transit speed before he followed her. The school group from Pellinor had reorganized themselves around the Terran damage control technician, who was teaching them a card game with the worn deck from his utility vest, dealing onto the overturned supply crate, while the teacher, Sevala, watched from a nearby cot with an expression that mixed relief and bemusement in roughly equal measure. Two of the adolescents had already figured out the game's bluffing mechanic and were winning consistently, much to the technician's visible and theatrical dismay. The three children from the lower deck slept through most of it, their breathing steady under the improvised masks, checking them every 30 minutes with the quiet regularity of a medic who has decided that these particular patients are hers until someone with better equipment takes over. At the 4-hour mark, Des walked the Paulith's corridors alone. The ship was quieter now. The urgency faded into the steady background hum of the atmospheric processors, and the patched fuel line conduit vibrating faintly at a frequency he could feel through the soles of his boots. The forward sections were at 91% atmosphere. The mid-deck was at 87. The lower deck, sealed and evacuated, was a controlled loss, its air slowly normalizing through the hull patches but not yet safe for habitation. He passed the school group section of the cargo bay and saw the teacher, Sevilla, sitting on a cot with the 8-year-old girl asleep against her shoulder. The girl's breathing was steady. The improvised mask adapter had slipped slightly, and Sevilla was holding it in place with one hand, the other arm wrapped around the child's back. She looked up as Des passed and nodded once, a small, careful movement that did not disturb the sleeping child. Des nodded back and kept walking. He found Ro in the Paulith's engine bay, sitting on a tool crate with a cup of Keshari tea that Kethros had apparently brewed from the transport's emergency galley supplies. The two engineers were talking quietly about metallurgy, of all things. Kethros was explaining the communion's approach to alloy stress testing, and Ro was describing a Terran technique for non-destructive fracture detection that used harmonic resonance to find hairline cracks before they propagated. They looked up when Des entered, and Ro straightened slightly. "Commander, the fuel line patch is holding steady. Kethros and I have been running thermal checks every 30 minutes. No degradation." "Good. How are the thrust governors?" "Calibrated for 60%. I helped Kethros adjust the input curve to account for the reduced fuel flow. She's running smooth." "And the halyard?" Ro's expression shifted slightly. "I won't lie to you, Commander. We stressed the port thermal coupler pretty hard during the sprint. It'll hold for the return to base, but it needs replacement. The starboard coupler is within tolerance, but I'll want the yard crew to inspect it." "Noted." "Commander," Ro hesitated. "The deviation. When they look at the engine logs, they'll see we ran past thermal critical for 23 minutes. That's going to generate a maintenance inquiry." "I know. I've already written the maintenance report. Thermal overstress during emergency sprint to render assistance to a Keshari vessel in distress. Consistent with Commander Vosk's report of passive signal detection." Des looked at him. Ro looked back, his face carrying the same careful neutrality that Annan's had carried and Kalos, and the same quiet decision underneath it. "We know what happened, and we're choosing the version that keeps you flying." "Thank you, Ro." "Just doing the maintenance report, Commander, that's all." 6 hours into the transit, the Communion Depot ship Varen's Reach intercepted them at the midpoint. The Keshari relief crews came aboard with full medical teams, engineering tenders, portable reactors, and the efficient, slightly embarrassed energy of a military that had been called and was arriving late. They were good. They were professional. They were 1 hour and 21 minutes behind a 12-person crew on a patrol frigate. The senior Communion officer, Vice Commander Dreveth Tun, reviewed Vosk's report on the Paulith's bridge. He read through the routing log, the atmospheric data, the timeline, and the account of the halyard's arrival and assistance. The report was clean, thorough, and precise. It described a standard patrol response to passive signal detection within the parameters of the compact. Tun set the report down. "I'd like to speak with Commander Marrow." The channel connected. "Commander Marrow." "Vice Commander." "I've read Commander Vosk's account. The Communion will formally acknowledge the halyard's assistance. You'll receive a citation from Fleet Command." Understood, Vice Commander. Your broad-spectrum array, a careful pause, that's sensitive equipment. Yes, sir. Sensitive enough to detect communion relay emissions at 31 light minutes. Apparently so, Vice Commander. A longer pause. Tun's voice dropped from the formal register to something quieter, more personal. Commander Marrow, I served in the Varan Shoals at the time of the Dravith Corridor incident. 7 years ago, I read the casualty report. I knew some of the names on it. One of them was a cousin of my wife's, a trader named Salith Vess. She was 41 years old and she was bringing agricultural equipment to the border settlements. Silence on the channel. The Communion remembers, Commander. We remember who was there that day. And we remember that the pilot flying wing cover was cleared by the board. The board cleared me. Yes, and now 7 years later you're here, 31 light minutes out, on a heading that doesn't match your patrol orders, with an intercept that your broad-spectrum array reportedly caught. He let the word sit. Reportedly. It carried the weight of a man who knew exactly what had happened and had chosen, deliberately, to accept the version of events that would let the other man keep flying. Commander Marrow, the Communion has no interest in how you heard the signal. The Communion is interested in the 409 people currently breathing aboard the Paulith. Understood, Vice Commander. Safe voyage, Commander. Safe voyage. The channel closed. Before the halyard undocked from the Paulith, Ko came back through the airlock one last time. She had stayed aboard the Keshari transport for the full transit, monitoring the 3 children and the deeper burn patients, and she came through the lock with her medical kit half empty and a look on her face that Des recognized from his own mirror. The particular tiredness of someone who has done something worth doing and is now paying for it in fatigue. How are they? Des asked. All 43 stable. The 3 children are awake and responsive. Tolev, the youngest, is breathing independently now. His lungs cleared faster than I expected. The bronchial wash worked. She paused. The Communion medical team that came aboard from the Varan's Reach confirmed my treatment protocols were sound. They said the improvised mask adapters were clever. She managed a small, exhausted smile. They want to document them for their cross-species emergency medicine database. You should let them. I already did. Gave them my field notes and the adapter specifications. If another Keshari ship has a human crew respond to an emergency, they'll have the template. Des nodded. Ko turned to go below, then stopped. Commander, that girl, the 8-year-old. What about her? When the Communion medics took over, she wouldn't let me leave. She held onto my wrist with both hands. I had to explain that I was going back to my own ship, but that the Communion doctors would take good care of her. Ko's voice was level, professional. She asked me if I would come back. I told her I didn't know. What did she say? She said, the ship that answers doesn't have to know why it came. It just has to come. Then she let go of my wrist. Ko went below. Des stood in the airlock corridor for a moment, alone. 8 years old. She had been breathing toxic air in a failing ship 2 hours ago, and she had offered him a sentence that was better than anything the Board of Inquiry had said in their entire report. Des sat alone on the halyard's bridge. Anand was below, supervising the thermal cooldown. Callow was in the nav bay, entering the broad-spectrum detection notation into the deviation logs with careful precision, making the record match the story that 3 different people on 2 different ships had quietly agreed to tell. The bridge was dim, running on standby power, the soft blue glow of the displays casting the only light. Through the forward viewport, the Varan's Reach was drawing alongside the Paulith, the big depot ship dwarfing both the transport and the frigate, her running lights illuminating the Paulith's scarred hull in long white sweeps. The relief was here. The mission, such as it was done. Des looked at his secondary display. Dark. It had been dark for 7 years. No games, no distractions. Nothing on that screen except the relay keys listener, waking every 60 seconds when they passed a communion relay, sweeping the encrypted band, waiting. He thought about what Vosk had done. A Keshari commander bound by the same compact that Des had violated had looked at the evidence of a 7-year intelligence crime, assessed the man who had committed it, and chosen to write a lie. Not out of weakness, not out of carelessness. Out of the same calculus that Des himself had made 7 years ago when he pocketed the relay key. Some rules exist to protect a system, and some situations exist to test whether the system's protectors are worth the protection. Vosk had decided that Des was worth protecting. Annan had decided it. Callow had decided it. Rowe had decided it. Even Tun, the vice commander, had decided it, with his carefully chosen word reportedly, and his deliberate refusal to ask questions whose answers would have required him to act. 4 people on 2 different ships had looked at what Des had done and chosen, independently, to let him keep doing it. He thought about the tiles. The game had been a simple pattern-matching exercise that Terran pilots played during long patrols to keep their reflexes sharp, except Des had been playing it for entertainment, not training, and his reflexes had been 2 seconds slow when the alarm sounded. 2 seconds, the length of a deep breath, the time it takes to look up from one screen and focus on another, the distance between 82 people alive and 82 people dead. He thought about Vasek, 27 years old, second tour, born on a station above Callie's prime, who had corrected his flight path to avoid Des's bad turn and flown straight into the second salvo. The flight recorder showed Vasek had been trying to turn back into the fight until the moment the structural failure took the controls from him. His hands had still been on the stick when they cut through the canopy. Des had listened to that recording once. He had not listened again. He thought about the 8-year-old girl on the Paulith, the one with the dark eyes who had watched him without fear or gratitude. He wondered what she would remember about today. Whether she would remember the ship's name, or the captain's name, or whether she would simply remember that the air came back, and a stranger juggled equipment to make her classmates laugh. He thought about what Vosk had said. The question was never whether the numbers even out. The question was whether you'd still be the kind of man who goes. Des reached over and keyed the relay partition. The stolen decryption key blinked once, green, and began its 60-second sweep of the communion band. Silence, routine traffic, a cargo manifest from an agricultural station in the outer shoals, a weather advisory for the Pelennor Transit Corridor, a maintenance schedule for the Varan Depot's secondary docking arms. Nothing urgent, nothing that needed him. The key completed its sweep and went dormant. It would wake again when the halyard's patrol route brought it within range of the next relay node. Des leaned back in his chair. Through the viewport, the Paulith was pulling away, escorted now by the Varan's Reach and its full complement of communion ships, lights steady, thrust stable, the 409 souls aboard breathing air that 12 Terran crew members had fought for with portable processors and improvised mask adapters, and a fuel line patch made of a compression sleeve and hull sealant. He would fly the next patrol, and the one after that. He would pass the relay and the key would listen, and the secondary display would stay dark except for that 60-second sweep. And someday, maybe, another signal would come through. A call aimed at someone else, a frequency he had no right to hear, a voice asking for help that was never meant for him. And he would go. Not because the debt was paid, it would never be paid, not because the arithmetic balanced, it never would. But because the man at the console was still there, still listening, still ready to change course when the call came. Because that was the only answer he had found in 7 years that let the names rest quiet, and because looking at the right screen was the only penance a pilot could keep. And far ahead, on the KCV Paulith, making slow headway toward the lights of the Varan shoals under reduced thrust, Commander Ashai Vosk composed the final line of his report. Intercept source, Passive signal bleed via Terran broad-spectrum scanning array. Unintentional detection. Standard patrol response. Within the boundaries of the Terran-Keshari Signal Sovereignty Compact, Article 14. He read the sentence twice. It was technically plausible, procedurally sound, and entirely false. He saved the file. He did not change a word. Because some debts are not settled by the truth. Some debts are settled by the lie that lets a good man keep flying.